Hello and welcome back to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. In today's programme, we've been looking at the reasons behind the growing crisis in the Central African Republic, which has seen the country's population terrorised by opposing militia groups and the daily death toll rising. The French Foreign Minister has warned that the CAR is on the verge of genocide. And last week, the UN Security Council authorised France to do whatever is necessary to protect the Central African Republic's 4.6 million people and to restore the government's authority, while an African Union peacekeeping mission slowly deploys also. And this week, the United States military said it will fly African forces into the CAR after France requested limited assistance with international efforts to halt the spread of violence between Christians and Muslims. Now, are these attempts to restore stability enough, or even the most appropriate course of action? And is there a role that Al-Qaeda is playing in this crisis? With me in the studio to discuss this, I'm still joined by James Schneider, Editor-in-Chief of Think Africa Press, Rob Williams, CEO of the humanitarian charity War Child, and Xavier Châtel, spokesperson for the French Embassy in London. On Skype, we have Rona Pelegal, Deputy Director of the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. Well, let me start with you, Xavier Châtel, this second half. I mean, what are the French trying to do?
Jonathan, we're trying to do a number of things, but first I should set out something which I think is really important, because somehow in the program it came, a bit of the backstage, while I think it should be really front stage. It's first and foremost for the Africans to take care of their own security, and this crisis is not an exemption. I would say it should even be an example. So the first pillar, if you look at the UN Security Council resolution, which authorized the use of military force to solve this crisis, what it says is fundamentally it authorizes an African force to do a number of things: restore security, disarm the militias, and facilitate a political transition, a political process, which should eventually lead to elections by 2015 and even earlier, actually 2014, as was decided by African heads of states in Paris just a few days ago. So it's really the Africans first. And the resolution then authorizes France for a temporary period to bring support to the African forces and within its means and capabilities to do all the missions.
They're preempting the African forces, or at least coming in earlier. The French are there before the African Union, aren't they?
No, there's already 2,500 African troops which are on the ground. They have been reinforced in two ways. First, legally, by this UN resolution. It's a Chapter 7 resolution, so it authorizes the use of force, robust mandate. And also, the resolution provides for a trust fund by which the international community is going to give money for equipment. UN planners are involved in the planning of the increased operation, and there's also, there will be French officers in the general staff in the headquarters of the African force, and the Africans are also building up the force. So there's going to be an additional, at the moment they have risen to 3,600. But the eventual objective, once again, which was agreed by 40 African heads of states and governments in Paris on the 6th and 7th of December, just a few days ago, the objective is to move to 6,000. So this is going to be the main force on the ground, and it's going to carry out all the functions that I said. And we are in support. Obviously, despite the very good quality of some of the contingents in this African force, they need our support. And we will provide it. But it's on a limited scale and for a limited time, although I think it's fair to say that the deployment of French troops is already showing some deterrent value on the ground. And I saw in your report something which was really interesting, that people are coming back in the streets. People are in the streets of Bangui. Some people are coming back and they feel more secure.
Let's ask Rona Pelegal from Human Rights Watch, because she has people on the ground in the north as well as in Bangui. Are you noticing already that people are feeling more confident and secure, the idea that there are these African Union forces and the French forces coming in?
My sense is that the residents of CAR have been looking for protection. They want peacekeepers. The African Union, while there, are stretched, and they haven't been as well resourced and as well staffed as we would have liked. So Human Rights Watch, among other organizations, has been pushing for enhanced support for the African Union peacekeepers, as well as consideration of a United Nations force to supplement what the African Union is doing. And we support what the French are doing as well, because we do believe that it provides an important measure of security in the country. I should say that the massacres that we have been documenting throughout the country are still taking place, both by ex-Seleka forces and by the anti-Balaka. The presence of peacekeepers, African or French or what have you, are very important in terms of giving a measure of confidence to civilians, and as well as putting militias on notice that they are going to be held accountable for their crimes.
James, I'd like to ask you about this point that I raised in the introduction about Al-Qaeda. I mean, in Mali, where the French went in and there has been a lot of trouble, Al-Qaeda was clearly involved in some way or another. Are they involved at all in this crisis?
No. Simple answer, no. There's been a few sources saying that there's rumoured that maybe Boko Haram, which is a northeastern Nigerian militia group, that maybe they're coming in. They're sort of saying, oh, well, maybe possibly because there's not that much governance here, that maybe some camps would be set up, but there's not really any kind of hard evidence that it's a big factor. I think it's just been sort of thrown in again because the people who work on CAR see that this is a humanitarian crisis of a really big measure, and some additional attention has just been attracted.
Because you did at one point mention that Sudan is relevant, and the conflict between North and South Sudan, which also doesn't actually involve much of Al-Qaeda either.
No, not in the slightest. I think it's kind of a misnomer. So people have wanted to sort of say, right, well, it's in this region, it's kind of nearby Mali, it's kind of nearby-ish, sort of southern Libya, and it's sort of around there, and there's a big problem with terrorism there, so we'll just kind of transpose that narrative onto the Central African Republic, which isn't helpful. In the same way that trying to say we're trying to avert Rwanda isn't either a useful narrative. The situation in the Central African Republic is pretty stark, it's pretty grave, and it should be viewed on its own terms.
Well, Rob Williams, I mean, there have been these clashes before between different groups, partly on a religious ground. Mm-hmm. And so why do you think that now, suddenly, it's become a sort of international crisis with the UN Security Council taking action, etc., and the media finally beginning to get interested?
It's a good question, isn't it? The humanitarian situation has always been difficult since I've had teams down in Central African Republic. Perhaps the presence of Western troops makes it more interesting to Western media. I do agree that the French government has promoted concern for this country at a time when the British government did not seem to be particularly interested. Now the British government is showing more interest. It could be that the religious flavour of the newly emerging militia clashes means that some people are beginning to take notice. That tends to push some buttons in the West, which a pure and simple humanitarian crisis wouldn't push. For whatever reason, and I don't know exactly what they are, I'm delighted that we're sitting here with you talking about humanitarian needs in the Central African Republic. We've been trying to get that on the news agenda in this country for a very long time. And today we have teams out in Bangui trying to find out what the needs are for this newly displaced population. And they're very, very basic. People are sleeping without mosquito nets, which is an extremely dangerous thing to do in Bangui at this time of year. There are acute food needs. The whole system for providing food aid to people in need needs to gear up again. Now the fighting has died down and you can actually walk around on the street. There is a huge amounts to do. And the irony is that children who are now hiding at home had just gone back to school in October. The schools had just reopened after all the upheaval of the coup in March. Now they're back at home or they're on the streets. And it's very worrying for us that there's a generation of children in Central African Republic who are just not getting educated.
Well, Sally, let me come back to your point that you said about how the idea is to find a political process and perhaps even elections in 2015 or even next year. I mean, is there not, wouldn't it be better to have a kind of government of national unity from people, communal leaders, from politicians from both the Muslim and the Christian areas, rather than an election in which, you know, the Christians will win because they're the dominant force in the population?
I think in this crisis, we shouldn't reinvent the situation. The current political ecosystem, if I could call it this way, is the result already of a series of mediations and political work in which there's been a very important work for particularly the economic community of Central African states, the ECAS, with a particular role for the Republic of Congo, which was very active in promoting this solution. They have adopted since the beginning of the year a number of documents which are sort of milestones in finding an agreement. They did so in Libreville, and they did so also in N'Djamena. The current authorities which there are in the Central African Republic are transition authorities. They have not been elected, but they are there as a transitional arrangement towards a political solution. The political solution, as you rightly point out, will need some guarantees for the communities. So this is in the shape of fighting against impunity. This is in the shape of the current transition authorities not being able to stand in the next elections.
Do they have Muslim representatives in these transitional authorities at the moment?
Say that again?
Do they have Muslim representatives in the transitional authorities?
Well, they are Muslims. I mean, the president is a Muslim.
Okay. So the other way around.
No.
Are there people from the other communities in there, or are they just the?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you have to consider what's going to happen now. The objective is to re-inject more democratic legitimacy in these authorities which have not been elected. So what has been done so far is there is a constitutional court, there is an authority on the media, a sort of local Ofcom. There's also an electoral code which has been adopted, but all the rest needs to be done, and it's going to take time.
You're sort of slightly shaking your head. I think you disagree with some of it.
No, I was just saying that two things. Firstly, there was actually, exactly as you say, the sort of thing that you were asking if there could be a transitional government of some sort that takes both sides together and so on. That's what there was earlier on in this year before the coup. François Bozizé was forced to the negotiating table by the Seleka rebels, and they came up with a transitional government with an independent, highly respected Prime Minister, who's still Prime Minister, Nicolas Chongai, in the current government. And I think something that he said stresses why just doing that is in no way enough when your state doesn't really exist and we've got such dire humanitarian situation. He says that the state is anarchy, the state doesn't exist past the presidential palace. And so it really doesn't matter who you can dress up with some kind of democratic or pseudo-democratic legitimacy if none of the fundamental questions are dealt with. It really doesn't matter if Michel Djotodio is sitting in the presidential palace or it's him and three other guys together, if the more fundamental things aren't dealt with.
Well, Rona, that's a really important point, what's sort of happening on the ground outside the presidential palace. I mean, we're focusing a little bit rather on the bad news, but I mean, are there areas of the country where Christians and Muslims and different ethnic groups are living perfectly normally and happily and calmly together without this violence, or has the violence now spread and pretty much covered the whole country and communities dividing from each other?
I would say that our experience is that these communities have lived peacefully for a long time, and that those ties are being ruptured by the use of religion to exploit tensions. We have had researchers in Buka, in Bosongora, in other places as well. And we are seeing the communities divided, with Christians, for example, seeking refuge at churches and Muslims at mosques or schools. And our goal has been both to speak about tolerance with both communities, but also to talk about what the human rights guidelines are in the country that all parties need to respect.
And are any of the communal leaders or religious leaders trying to foster unity, or are they rather leading this sort of hysteria about division and you can't trust the other people and you have to arm yourself?
No, actually, our experience with the religious leaders is that they've been doing a very good job of trying to promote this kind of tolerance, but the ex-Saleka are largely targeting and retaliating against largely Christian communities. And similarly, the anti-Balaka are targeting Muslim civilians.
Well, Rob, let's come back to Bangui. I mean, we know that there's several 100,000 people near the airport in Bangui. Are there lots of other camps in Bangui as well, or is that the main place where the Christians are now going?
No, they're going to lots of different places. Today you'd find 15,000 people gathered around the airport. Last night there were 40,000 people. People seem to be going there to sleep. And there are similar patterns in different churches around Bangui and also in orphanages, which I won't name, but there are people who stay there during the day and people go there overnight to sleep. I think the French action combined with the African Union troops will from today start to make Bangui a much more secure place. The disarmament process, which took place over the last 2 days, caused some confusion, as was commented on by the package we saw at the beginning of the programme. People were left undefended. There was a lot of looting which went on behind the disarmament process, and particularly Muslim shops were looted yesterday as Muslims themselves were moved away by armed forces, so they were unable to protect their shops and businesses. But there's a huge need now for food aid to be mobilised, and there's a real need for donors to step up to the other challenges of an emergency like this. You can look at food, water and shelter, but you also need to think about child protection and the trauma which children have experienced. And you need to get to grips with dealing with those kinds of issues. There is good news. Donors are stepping forward. The British government itself put out £10 million last week and invited NGOs to come to them with ideas about how they might use that to quickly make the situation much better for people who are displaced. So if the crisis has done one thing, it's raised the interest level in the donor community.
And do you think that will survive, as it were, or is it just a sort of 1 week crisis and then next week they'll forget it?
I hope that this will actually start a very long process of properly funding humanitarian needs. And it's already been said, but you can't really build a peace if people are struggling to eat. The temptation to start fighting again is one that needs to be addressed with food, water, shelter, security, and proper protection for families and children. Until those are in place, a political process is going to really struggle.
Well, Xavier, let me come back to you. I mean, 2 French soldiers unfortunately were killed the other day during this disarmament process. I mean, is French public opinion really solidly behind this intervention?
Well, first, I'd like to pay tribute to these soldiers, and that's why I'm wearing today the French poppy. This blue thing I have on my jacket this is the French poppy. So, the second thing is, at the moment, I think in Europe, and France is no exception, there's a bit of an intervention fatigue. In general, people after Iraq, although France was not part of it, Afghanistan, the difficulties occurring in Libya. So people believe that there are some difficulties with international interventions. At the same time, people have very well understood that Mali, for instance, was an absolute necessity. Al-Qaeda was just about to topple the government of a friendly country and would have literally put the country in terror. They were destroying UNESCO World Heritage and doing absolutely appalling things. So people have very well understood that it was necessary, like it or not. And in the case of the Central African Republic, I think people have also very well understood that there is a country which is going in a spiral of violence, sectarian and other, and falling into chaos and being literally the prey of all sorts of atrocious behavior. Mm-hmm. So they understand it. And the latest opinion polls just before the beginning of actual operations were mildly favorable. And usually from experience, after the operations have started, it rises because first, it's a window for people on what is happening in the country. They're realizing how appalling the situation is. They're realizing that having French troops which started to patrol, first we had, fighter jets flying overhead, and then we had armored vehicles patrolling the main axes in the city, particularly in Bangui. And since Sunday, we have foot soldiers, doing foot patrols. This is bringing a degree of order and a degree of protection to people, even though, they're not always at any place, any time.
Is there any risk, do you think, that the actual arrival of foreign European troops, non-Muslim troops, will encourage Al-Qaeda to come in, so that even if they're not there now, they will start infiltrating because of the French presence?
I think there's two elements to your question. The first thing is, are these non-Muslim troops? I would challenge this, because you remember there will be 6,000 African troops and only 1,600 French troops. Out of the 6,000, there's a number of troops from countries which are Muslim countries. That includes Chad and others. I mean, so predominantly or majority Muslim countries. So I'm not sure this distinction applies in that case. And then there's the second question, which was alluded to by James earlier in discussion, which is this Al-Qaeda thing. We're not saying CAR is a fundamentally terrorist problem. I think we wouldn't rule out one day that when you have in a region like this a failed state, a situation of chaos, and an ability that we know from Mali of terrorist groups to roam through vast expanses of territory with pickup trucks and to move from one place to another.
I'm sorry to cut you off. We're coming to near the end. I just want to give everybody else a chance to sort of have a final word. James, your final word. A failed state in a year's time, will we be sitting here with a worse situation or a better one than today?
I hope we'll be sitting with a more stable situation. It will be less bad, in part because the world is turning its attention, and in part because of African solidarity and French support.
And Rob, your prediction?
This is a pretty bad place to start from, but I think if donors really pay attention and apply themselves to what the UN is asking for in terms of aid and support charities like War Child on the ground, I'm hopeful there'll be a better situation.
And Rona, I mean, at least we're giving it attention by having a program about it. Do you think things will improve over the next year?
Well, I'm not necessarily comfortable with making predictions. One thing I would say is that holding accountable the people who have committed crimes, whether part of the Ex-Alega or Anti-Balaka, will be essential to securing CAR's future.
Well, on that note, we'll have to come to an end. Thank you, Rona Pellegal. Thank you, James Schneider. Thank you, Rob Williams. And thank you, Xavier Chatel from the French Embassy. And, of course, thank you for watching.